Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm going to talk about housing. इसके टाइटल पे affordable housing for all तो लगा दिया है, but I'm not actually going to talk about that. In the sense that affordable housing for all has a number of problems of definition and also of approach and so on. It is a slogan that has been used. Primarily it was UN Habitat and the UN system that used it. It's a better slogan than saying low-cost housing or low-income housing that has other problems. But the worst problem for this slogan is that in America, in Europe, it means housing that cannot be afforded. If you look up on the internet affordable housing, you will get a lot of documents, particularly from the United States, talking about policy, rules, regulations for affordable housing. They have used the word affordable as a noun to define a kind of house which cannot be afforded. That means that for a particular income, if you cannot afford a house, then the government has got a series of subsidies which it provides to make it affordable. In other words, a house that you cannot afford, by applying affordable housing, it then comes into that ambit. So a lot of the discussion is in the current literature is about the subsidies and the processes and the regulations of how to, or what should be given to make that house affordable, not in the sense of affordability as we used to understand it, where affordability was an attempt to make the ability of people to pay for, to purchase, to acquire housing equal to or exceed the price of the house itself. So it's a slight shift, but it makes a difference. And so I now prefer not to make a reference to this, and I thought it would be important for you to at least be aware that if you do look up on the net or other sources, they're talking effectively about unaffordable houses. And when they talk, as I say, they talk about subsidies. That raises the question, when we say affordable housing, affordable for whom? We used to mean, and we talk about affordability for the individual, but as soon as you bring in subsidies, we are talking about affordable for society. We are talking about affordable for the economy. It also, we need to question whether it's affordable for the environment. The kinds of houses that some people have produced, or the kinds of housing, is it affordable for the culture? So affordability in terms of for whom and how and so on has those issues. So I think I prefer to use a slightly different terminology. And I'm going to talk about trying to resolve Pakistan's housing. I like the word resolve. It has slightly different meanings and connotations. Resolve has three dictionary meanings: to settle a contentious matter, and that's what I think, maybe not resolve, but at least to raise a contentious matter is part of what a dialogue is all about. So it's also, resolve does mean to find solutions, but resolve means also to decide firmly on an action, on a course of action, to resolve to do something. So it has, I think, a better kind of ring, and I'll try to talk about some of the issues behind this, because I think that unless we understand the basics or agree, or agree to disagree, what do we mean by housing? What is the problem? Why has it not been solved? And I mean, it hasn't been solved anywhere for any country. So we are not alone, but if there was a queue of people in their successes for solving housing, we're pretty much at the back of the queue. I'm sure you are aware that virtually every government in Pakistan has, at some point in its tenure, launched a housing scheme. It used to be a 5 marla scheme, then a 3 marla scheme, then apna ghar, phir apni basti, phir khuda ki basti. Everybody has done that. If you look at the figures, it's quite rare to find even 5 or maximum 10% of the promised houses actually being built. In most cases, what happens is a big announcement of a scheme and then the transfer of public land to private or semi-private developers, and that's the end. We hear no more about it. Ironically, a lot of the schemes that are put forward are not even on paper affordability. In practice, of course, they end up by not being affordable at all. So I'd like to talk about a little bit about some of those actions. I am not saying that there is an answer that I'm going to unfold or give to you, but I try to lead you, or let's lead us, see if we can find solutions. And then is the third one, is whether we can actually get a decision or whether what we should do if we do have some resolve about housing. Just to start, as I said, trying to define some of these terms. I mean, obviously, we know what a house is, and that's one of the things about housing. Everybody knows, everybody's experienced, everybody perhaps has a view on it. So a house, obviously, is any structure where a household lives. It's 4 walls and a roof. A household is a group of people, whether it's related or not, living in the same housing unit, contributing to one or more activities like housing or food that sustains the household. But housing has 2 meanings again. Housing as a noun, I think this is a housing scheme and so on, but also housing as a verb. We talk about the whole process of housing. And I think, again, when we talk about what to do, how to do it, we should make that distinction. It's important. It's important for the individual because, of course, it provides shelter. It's important for society because it's an essential ingredient in the propagation of society, in creating communities, in effect also giving identity to people. But it's important for the economy. It's perhaps one of the major contributors to the economy, not only in the fact that you build a house and so on, but without a house, you're unlikely to buy a fridge. So a lot of the white goods industry relies on housing. So if you don't have a house, all of that, so the multiplier effect of housing is quite important for the economy. And for the city, of course, it is a major purpose and function of a city. Why have a city at all if you're not talking about housing? It's the primary component of a household. It gives, again, identity to a city. It also occupies about 30% of all urban land. And a lot of the other things, like transportation, primarily is how to get people from the houses to their jobs, or from the houses. So it's an important ingredient for the city as well. So what is the problem? The sort of 4 things that people will talk about is just, first of all, there's just the magnitude problem, that there are too many people, and that's the problem. That's why we have a housing problem. When they talk about houses, then the argument is that, houses are unavailable, or they're unaffordable, or even if they are, maybe they are unacceptable. And we can talk about all of these. We can talk about that the housing problem is one of land. Dr. referred earlier saying that we have a lot of land, and which is indeed true. In terms of total land in Pakistan, the sum total of all urban land is about 2% of the land area of Pakistan. So even if you said the cities were to double in size, which is the big bugbear cities are taking over, another 2%. In the greater scheme of things, it's not a lot of land. So land is available. Of course, it depends on what kind of land you occupy and so on. But land is there. But when they talk about the problem, you said there isn't the land. And of course, when we talk about affordability, then the problem is stated in terms of finance, that finance is unavailable. or that finance is too expensive or can't be secured. And here is a quote from the blog of Zameen, which is, I really like that the site at least that the organization has talking about housing issues and so on, particularly middle and upper income housing. They said, and I quote, that the present housing shortfall in Pakistan is about 10 million units, and it is expected to double in the coming 1 decade, including the depletion of some of existing housing stock. According to the latest statistics, the total number of houses built every year in Pakistan is somewhere between 0.15 and 0.2, 15 to 20,000 million, whereas we need 1 million new houses annually, 0.7 for population growth and 0.3 million for replacing old houses and to cover the existing shortage. This pretty much summarizes what maybe 80-90% of the discussion, the dialogue, the writing on housing about Pakistan consists. You might argue a little bit about the figures, but it's a nice round figures, it's easy to remember, so we talk about it in those terms, and that's fairly typical. But the problem with a lot of the discussion is that there are some assumptions that are made, unfortunately, without questioning. And I have no problems if somebody says that, yes, this is what a house is, or this is what it should be, but at least let us A, be clear that these are assumptions, and B, that there are different ways of talking about it. Most commonly, we equate housing need with housing shortage. What we say is that if you take the number of households and you subtract the number of houses, that is what will give you housing need. The problem with that is that it doesn't talk about housing demand. If you do the sums and you say there are 10 households and 8 houses, the need is 2. Okay, 8 minus 10 is 2. But nobody talks about that. Whether you produce those 2 houses, whether there will be anybody willing or able to purchase them. Will they be in the right place? Will be of the right type? Forget whether they will be of the right cost. So need is not always equal to a shortage. No mention is made of housing demand. We have, let's say, I'm using a very simplified number, let's say in a country, 10 households. Is that because those 10 households can't find an 11th house, so a household is not formed? Is it because the housing is so expensive and so people are not breaking out from that household? Is it that the socio-cultural makeup and aspirations of our countries are such that you don't get married until you don't have a house? So if you have so many households, to what extent is there suppressed demand? To what extent is there hidden demand? So we are not talking about, we just take the simple figures for the numbers of households and just assume that if you subtract households from that. The big problem with that is that the census, which is our main source of counting the number of households, classifies each household, as I did in a couple of slides before. They are the people that are living in a house. So by definition, a household lives in a house. So every time you count a household, it must be living somewhere, so there is a house. So the number of houses and the number of households is always going to be equal. You cannot have a household without a house. You can have a house without a household, but the other way it can't. So you can't have a housing shortage if you take that definition. We have to go beyond that, and I'll raise some of these issues. Then the worst thing, or gets worse, that when we talk about housing shortage, when we talk about housing need, most of us take the lazy way out and we use the average household size. Supposing we were to actually produce that number of houses, it would be the wrong size of house, it would be too big for many, it would be too small for others. If you have a country where, let's say, the average household size is 6 or 7, which is about what it is in Pakistan. But there are a large number of people that are living in small households. 2 people just got married, 2 people and a child, 3. That means that we are going to be undercounting households if we use 10. If there are people, and you can see this in the difference between the provinces, in KPK, for example, households are much larger because the social pattern is different. So you can't. So if you use just the standard housing, it's not very good for making any assumptions about what the size of the problem is, what the cost of the solution is, and so on. So average household size, I think, is not the best way of doing it. As soon as you talk about housing in terms of policies and so on, you have to start disaggregating and at least talk about the range and so on. There are other assumptions that are made. One very common one is to assume that if a house is made out of mud, it needs to be replaced. There is no logic behind that, other than it's a similar kind of thing which says, because it's made out of mud, and the most of us see some houses that are made out of mud in the cities, in the Kachi Abadis, we assume that all of them must be in that bad situation and so on, which is not true. A lot of mud houses, a mud building, if it's properly looked after, can well last 100 years. There are lots of societies, lots of people where the house with maintenance and repairs will be as long lasting as a cement or a concrete house. So ipso facto, by in itself, just because a house is made out of mud, we cannot say that that needs to be replaced. I'm saying this because when they count what is the housing need, you make an assumption that all of those, so you look down the construction, and if the house is made out of mud, you say, well, that tick off, that's another one that needs to be replaced. There is another assumption that the houses that are overcrowded need replacing. And overcrowding is usually defined on the basis of other countries, or by citing UN Habitat, which talks about the fact that if there are 3 or more persons per room, the house is overcrowded. It's not a universal definition. I may be mistaken, I'd love for somebody to tell me otherwise. I have not seen a single study in Pakistan which talks about how people live, how people house themselves, what is their preferences. When we say that more than 3 people to a room constitutes overcrowding, what is the basis for that? If you have a society where a large number of the population, that means that within each household, a large number of the members of the households are children, very often even below 10, you might have a household with 3 or 4 people that has 3 children, and a couple, let's say. The children are all under the age of 10, sometimes even under the age of 5. So if they all live in one room, is that overcrowding? Should they be living in 3 rooms to meet the criteria of the other ones? I'm not saying that that's not correct, but I would just love to see somebody to tell me that yes, they have done some surveys, they've talked to people to say that ideally, how do you want to use a house? So we might argue that if you have a house that has only 1 room, it limits choice, but to argue that the figure of 3 plus 1, and certainly the UN has never said that this is a standard. Itself, the UN also uses, in some studies, a figure of 4 or more. Interestingly, even if you use that figure, in Canada, there are 350 such people, 350,000 such people that are overcrowded. The actual overcrowding is not as much as that, it's very different. So we need some discussion about how people use houses before we can start simply saying that 3 or more people are overcrowded. In the UK, they talk about 2 people, or if there are more than 2 people per room, then the house is supposed to be overcrowded. But they don't count children under 10 years old. Now, look at the difference that you would get if you were using a straight, that if a household is more than 3, it's overcrowded, therefore it's a housing shortage, compared to if you said if you use the UK definition and said it's more than 2, but you discount the children that are under 10, you will find that the number of overcrowded houses would drop tremendously. Similarly, that many people will argue or use the figure that all slums means that those are the houses that need to be replacing. So if you're living in a slum, by definition, we unfortunately misuse the word slum. It's not a slum. A Kache Abadi is a better name for it. And that all Kache Abadis need replacing. According to UN Habitat's definition, 74% of all Pakistani houses are in slums. So, do we need to replace all 74% of those? But equally, when you look at the criteria used to define a slum, they use 5 criteria. 3 of those criteria, which is security, water supply, and sanitation, doesn't say anything about the house. It does say something about housing, but it's not a house. But these things are provided not by the household so much as they are and should be provided by the urban authority. I cannot provide security just in my own home. I cannot even, in an urban context, provide water. I know in Islamabad people have to dig their own bore wells in their gardens and get the water out, but that's not what living in urban cities should be. So whether you have water or not is not a housing shortage. It's a shortage of infrastructure. Similarly with sanitation. There are 2 other criteria. One of them is the standard of construction, and that is, I talked about it in the sense that just because it's made out of mud doesn't make it overcrowded. Might do. It doesn't mean that it needs replacing, and overcrowding, and I've just been talking about that. Then a lot of people talk about, when they talk about what is the need for housing, you say, okay, these are the number of people, the number of households, and we make a projection. At the same time, then they make a projection of housing, a projection of housing production. So you, just like you do with population, you sort of draw a line and you say, okay, last year it was this, in the present census it was this, so in the future the number of people will be so much. Contentious, but okay, it's acceptable. But just because in 1950 they produced 10 houses, in 1960 it was 20, in 1970, that's no guarantee or no reason why today you project that and say, therefore they'll produce 120. And so you can't use that as a way of calculating what the housing shortage is. When we talk about affordable housing, we talk about the fact that the funds and finance should be equal to or more than the price of housing. The price of housing is, first of all, not the cost of housing. So when we talk about affordability, we should be talking or looking at least at what the cost of housing is rather than just the price of housing. But the funds and finance that is available is a matter of supply. And that, again, doesn't have so much to do with housing. It's more of a generalized thing. Now, but what is interesting is that when we talk from a household's point of view, the funds that are available to a household is primarily its income. So we're saying that in very simplified terms, that the income of the household should be such that they can buy a house that is available at the available price. Why don't we talk about it the other way around and say that the income should be sufficient to be able to buy a house? Why is it that we talk about housing and the housing as a problem, but not about income as the problem? Just look at it, what it does. If you talk about the cost of housing and you throw that back and say, oh, the household should do this, the finance should do, and if we then subsidize this, which is what, as I said, in the West now, that's the way to make it affordable, who are we subsidizing? You think this is a policy for helping poor people? No. That's as much a policy for helping big business. I want to employ you, but I don't want to pay you enough money. So I don't pay you enough money to be able to afford a house. So then I ask the government to subsidize you? No. I'm asking the government to subsidize me, We should count that as a cost for doing business, not as something that somehow you are to blame that you are poor and you can't afford a house. So you need to look at both sides of this when we talk. So it's also interesting that every time somebody talks about subsidies, they talk about subsidizing the production or the producers of houses. And the subsidy goes to the house. Imagine what happens here. Let's give free land. Let's reduce the cost of materials and so on, so that I can build a cheaper house as a business. As I said, what you're doing is that you're allowing that money to go into my pockets. So it's not the cost, it's the price. I can charge more for it. Why don't we give that subsidy to the people? It's the household that is poor. Why don't we subsidize the household? If you must subsidize somebody, why subsidize house and so on? So again, that we can talk about that and the aspects of that. When we look, so and I've already talked about this, the idea that affordable housing in the UK and US is different. So just briefly, what is the problem? In fact, is there a problem? This is a graph which talks about the state of housing in the terms that we all think it ought to be. So if you ask anybody what is the objective of housing policy or whatever, we talk about a house for all. We have affordable housing for all. So you'd think, my God, Pakistan must be in a really bad state. We can't afford housing, big housing shortage. This is Pakistan. Owner-occupied houses as a percentage of total. It's pretty close to 90%. I wish the Germans would say, I wish we had that problem. Where's Germany? Oh, sorry, it's not here. But take any of these countries. Korea, Malaysia, even the USA, 62. UK, 43%. My God, that should be a problem. They don't cry about it in the same way. And that's certainly not the way that we talk about housing. So, what is going on? You want to give housing for all? 90% already have it. So it's not a housing shortage. Here is figure for housing debt. Normally we would say that the greater the debt, you've got some problem with your economy. The housing debt as a percentage of GDP in the UK is over 80%, in the USA it's 80%, in Pakistan it's about 3%. So what's the problem? So is there not a problem at all? In this way, I would say, well, 90% of the people have houses. We owe very little. We can afford to give subsidies, give debt. So is there a problem? As I said, by the Census of Pakistan definition, if you count the number of households, number of houses, they match. So there should be no problem. So we got another reason. But clearly, there is a problem. There's a survey conducted by Shelter for Homeless People, which said that there were 185,000 homeless people in Lahore. And these are people sleeping under an underpass in the middle of the road. Around 98% were male, while 2% are female. Interesting. So what's happened to all the women? I mean, I know women are invisible in Pakistan, but if they're homeless, these people are sleeping on the streets, are they not married? They're not. These don't look like the young youth. We're not talking about that. No, they're in the rural areas. They're in another small city. So it's not that they don't have a house. These are people who have come to the city. So Lahore may have homeless people, and there are some of these people that have been in Lahore sleeping like this for a couple of years. So we need to examine some of these things of what is the real problem. This is a very real problem. If you look at the sort of population pyramid for Lahore, it's not a pyramid. There's a huge arm sticks out for males in the ages of 18 to 25, 30. Those are homeless people because they are individuals that are not members of households but have come to Lahore as migrants to work. Their problem, their needs are not going to be met by Apna Ghar and Khuda Ki Basti and so on. No, there's a different problem. So the nature of the problem is very different. So the question really is, Is there a problem? Yes, there is a problem. Of course, there is a problem of housing quantity, but more importantly, of housing quality. As I said, 90% may own houses, but their quality may not be good. There is a problem of land affordability and land accessibility, of finance availability, terms and conditions. But much more importantly than that, the real problem is of market failure. The market, which depends on where you are in the political spectrum and so on, the market is the great solver. That if there was a demand, they will meet the need, and if there's a housing shortage, must be a demand, so the market will adjust and they will provide a supply to meet that demand. So we have a massive market failure. But there is also a failure of government policy. This is something that's quite obvious, that we know this. So if there is a housing problem, but the housing problem is primarily one, or I would argue, largely one of government policy, rather than of affordability and so on and so on. Let me just talk about this. Just talking about housing market. If you'll, well, I've even lost track of time. I didn't know when we started. I'm just going to talk very briefly because I don't know how many of you are here are not economists. And if you're not an economist, your view of housing from an architecture point of view, from an engineering point of view is very different. We don't look at the market so much. But so if you'll allow me a slight excursion, I'll talk about why the housing market doesn't work. Very simply, we can talk about any housing as being related to income and to housing expenditure. And we can argue that as income increases, the expenditure on housing also increases. So there is a relationship. In different situations, this line may have a different slope, but it's a generally rising line which says that as your income goes up, your expenditure on housing goes up. But equally, as it goes up, it doesn't keep on going, it doesn't reach the moon, because the richer you are, you're also, doesn't mean that you are a fool and keep on spending more and more on housing. At some point, you realize there's only so much you can spend on a house. You put your gold taps, you've got gold wallpaper, you've got 6 cars, garage in there, but there's no limit to your income. So clearly that line isn't going to go on. At some point it's going to turn up. In the same way, unfortunately, it doesn't mean that if your income is 0, you can get housing for 0. So that line also has a limit and it will turn down. If you accept that, and as I say, I'm going to keep rushing on, but I'm open to somebody saying no, or I'm wanting to ask a question at any time, and we can talk about it or explain it. I just want to introduce a couple of other lines. If we say that there is some point where this happens to the relationship between income and housing, that at some point, even though your income may be increasing, your expenditure on housing is not increasing at the same rate, and perhaps not increasing at all. At that income level, you can call the line of affluence, so there's the affluence line of income, and similarly, at the level where this relationship breaks down because there is no cheap enough housing to match the low enough income, you can call that as a poverty line. And I'm not talking about this as poverty defined by food baskets and so on. I'm talking about it as housing poverty. There is another line which is very important for housing and housing consideration, which is the credit line. That there's an income level at which you can get access to credit. If you have a high enough income, you can walk into a bank, you can negotiate with the bank manager in Pakistan. The bank manager will probably give you some tea as well, talk to you. As your income goes down, you find it's more and more difficult to get access to credit from a bank or whatever the financial institution is. And indeed, very soon you reach income levels at which you aren't even allowed to go inside the bank, let alone have tea with the manager. So if you understand this, then let me introduce then what the housing response is. If you have an income above that line, so that's your credit line, that means you can, this income you can borrow from financial institutions, so you can add to your income if you need it, and you can either buy or you can build a house. The higher up you go, the easier it is, obviously. Similarly, if your income is below that, so your income is somewhere here, you may not be able to buy or to build, but in most countries, you can at least rent a house and below that level. But the problem, as we are well aware, is for the people that are in this situation, so you are below the housing poverty line, where you don't have access either to rental housing or to be able to build a house. Yeah? When we look at that and we say, well, why is the market not reaching these people? These are the sort of people that, as I said, in the West, we talk about the need for affordable housing. We then have to start making some interventions or influencing the market. And that's where we introduce the idea of social housing or public housing, that you accept that these people have. So most housing policy then consists of defining who, that is in terms of income certainly, can have access to what kind of housing, and how, what is the process, what is the procedure. So housing policy consists of defining who is going to have what kind of housing and what they need to do to qualify for that. Increasingly, in the who with the income, we've also added vulnerable groups. So in some countries, if you're older than something, or if you're a particular gender will have access, or people with income, or people in a particular place, or of a certain ethnicity. So that effectively defines what housing policy is and how you should go about it. So when we look at this problem, why has that not been able to be resolved? By influencing the policy, by the market acting as the market. And the first thing to say is that housing has not always been a problem. Nowhere. In no country is the case that the housing problem has always been with us. Until the last century, housing was not really a problem, or at least not a social or a one problem for society. Housing has become a problem as the mode of production has changed. We started to separate house and home and work and workplace. So it's become a shift during that process where we've gone to the mode of production which separates workers from work, and at the same time, the land has shifted from community to individual. There was a time in almost every society when nobody owned land. Land was not something that you bought or you sold. At best, it belonged to a community to use. In the same way, now land has shifted from community to individual, and from place, land used to be a place, it was, you refer to it, it's now become a product. And in that process, the rate of growth of population has increased. Again, I think the major reason for that being that we don't allow people to die. A lot more people used to die before than they do now. Quite apart from that, okay, more people are born, but there are only more people born because fewer people are dying. So when it's not your fault only that it's medicine and health and so on that is stopping people from dying. It's not nobody's fault, but it's also not the fault of the households themselves. And we've now started to get an increase of population in cities, and this is reducing access to infrastructure. Remember that I said that one of the causes or criteria for saying a house has a problem is because it doesn't have water supply or sanitation or access to infrastructure. So it is the fact that we've changed the way that we start to get a failure in the market, because the market cherry picks. People who make up the market, the suppliers, the producers, they're not fools. That's why they're rich. And one of the things that they know is that whatever it is, whichever product you're making, it's easier to make. There are some products that are easier to make. It costs or takes about the same kind of problem or hassle or trouble to build a house, whether it's a cheap house or an expensive house. But if you sell one expensive house, you make more money than selling 10 cheap houses. So why would you make the effort to sell the 10 cheap houses when you could sell one expensive house? So you can make a lot more money from selling one very expensive product than lots of small ones. It needs the Chinese to come in and say that you can make money from lots of small ones, but there's lots more Chinese than there is anybody else. So the market cherry picks. It's not going to start addressing the problem of the low-income people or of households until there is no other venue open for them. Left to its own devices, they will cherry pick. The market also, for any product, doesn't want to meet demand. It needs to increase demand. Steve Jobs didn't get where he got to, now he's the maker, but you don't get big by meeting demand. Meeting demand is relatively easy. What you need to do is to keep increasing demand. Look at the houses that we are now selling as being essential. That's going up, so it's making it, you are increasing the demand. You want to get better. So the market isn't in the business of meeting demand. The market campaigns against government handouts on the one hand. If you look at American politics, it's all about how we must not give handouts to the poor, that makes them lazy. They said, no, if you give the handouts to me, we producers will make better use of the money, and we're looking for subsidies for the producers. So housing subsidies, as I was talking before, are designed to go to the producers and not to the households. And at the same time, it's the same market which keeps wages so low that the people can't afford it. So you create a problem, you then use the gains from that to increase demand, which further creates a problem. So the market isn't going to supply it. What about the government? How does it influence this? How does it influence the market? I'm now talking about the same things and saying that that's the same diagram that I had there. And we said who, what, how. And we said that in housing policy, a government has some instruments. And these are which change the way how you access housing. So the instrument that a government has is building and planning standards. And what the objective of that, of building and planning standards also, amongst other things, is to define what is the maximum house. You define how big a plot you can build, and that affects what is the biggest house you can build, which affects how much that house can cost, which affects this line. Housing finance is another instrument which determines access, and it increases this, has an impact on the credit line. Construction standards and costs, which define what a minimum house is, and so that affects this line. Because if I have very high standards and say that's the minimum house, when Jomo Kenyatta became, after independence of Kenya, he became president, he wanted to have a housing policy, and he said that my people didn't fight the British to get their independence if they are going to live in a one-room house. So everybody should have a minimum of 2 rooms. That's a nice statement, but it ignores sort of what you can have. But if you use that kind of standards, then this line is going to move up, and more people are going to become housing poor. Housing legislation, which determines rent, so it determines whether or not people will be willing to supply rental housing. Your welfare policy, which of course talks about social housing. And then you have housing design, which obviously influences costs, urban planning, which determines the availability of land, and urban development, which has a direct impact on costs, particularly of infrastructure. So there are different tools that a government has which can be used to influence this and either raise or lower the credit line, raise or lower the affluent line, and indeed to raise or lower the housing poverty line. What happens when you try to use these instruments? So if you try to attack this problem, I'm taking that same diagram that I just showed you, that's on this side. Oops. and introduce another diagram, which is the same scale here, income, but instead of talking about housing expenditure, which can keep on increasing, we're going to talk about the percentage of the population. So we only have 100% of the population. So we put that on a scale here. That means the same income here, so this scale is the same. We add percentage and see what happens when you try to use housing policy. And it's the similar kinds of tools that people use in any country and any government, different times, different purposes, but you add onto this a line which represents the distribution of population. So we say that in this country we have an income distribution line like that. And if we change the credit line from this level, say, to this level, make it easier for people to borrow, what it does is that the people that can have access to buy or build their houses, which used to be at this point, they now become at this point. So instead of about 60% not being able to get access to credit, it reduces to about 30%. The number is sort of halved. What happens if you take a policy like this, and I can go on about how different countries have tried to introduce this policy and the ease or otherwise of doing it. But the same policy, if you introduce this here in Pakistan, our income distribution isn't like this. Our income distribution is more like this, which means that if there were people above the affluent line, which were about 10% in, say, United Kingdom, it's about the same in Pakistan. But the people who had access to credit in the UK may have been 60%, and in Pakistan, maybe a bit less than that. 40% had access to credit in the UK, and in Pakistan, it will be something like 30% or 25%. But look at the impact of this policy measure. It brought in here, about half the people into the credit-worthy or credit-able group, but in Pakistan, that same drop only adds about 7 or 8% to the number of people. So it's who has access to credit, what is the distribution of income, which means that a very simple thing, which is the basis of a lot of housing policy, the whole Labour conservative housing policies varied between who should have access to credit and therefore who should have policies, social housing based on this. But it also has another aspect, that if you said that government is going to be providing make houses affordable by giving subsidies and so on, in the UK, if I take this as a diagram, that means about 10%. And so you're using the income from the taxation of this 90% to subsidize the housing of this 10%. Possible, or at least plausible. But you do that in Pakistan, you forget the fact that nobody pays, or very few people pay taxes. But even if you did, you have a situation where 70% of the people need a subsidy. So you have a very small tax base, and obviously you can't use the same policies that you can use in a developed country and so on. So if the market works in the same kind of way, it leaves out people, but government intervention in market cannot be done in the same kind of way. What can you do? What do governments do? And what I've tried to do is to say that if you take those instruments that I've just been talking about, and you say that was the objective, here I put some countries sort of fairly random in a way of saying the USA, for example, had the basis of a lot of its housing policies have been to change the access to credit. They got into trouble a few years ago, as you all know, when the people started giving or extending credit to people without checking their credit worthiness and so on. In India, there used to be a long history of rent controls as the main policy measure. In the UK, as I said, they were using social housing provision and welfare policy. In Indonesia, they used housing costs and housing design, where they said that every developer that has a housing development must give a certain percentage or as many a number of houses for each house. So they use that to reduce this. A similar policy in Malaysia and so on. And just in Iraq, they started to give land. Saddam Hussein's government gave a lot of land to people if you were a member of the party and so on. So there were political reasons for doing this. I didn't put Pakistan here because we don't have a policy. We don't have a ministry. I mean, we have a Ministry of Housing. The task of the Ministry of Housing is to build houses for the government. It is not a Ministry of Housing in the same way that most other countries have housing. Incidentally, Pakistan has a housing policy. It's probably one of the best, most well-written housing policies in the world. The Housing Policy 2001, which was accepted by the government, has never been put into law. So legally, we don't have a policy. We don't have a ministry. It's not even a national subject. It's been devolved. So you can't just say, well, this used to be the program, we'll now devolve it to the provinces, and then the provinces decide to either devolve it or not devolve. So Pakistan is not here because Pakistan doesn't have a policy. I'm happy to talk about it. They may have a de facto. No, there isn't even a de facto policy. So what about the government? If it hasn't been, why do governments fail to supply the housing that is needed? And just like the market, we have to recognize the government always has a political agenda. The government wants to be seen as being given, and particularly in our country. If the government can't actually have a photograph, or the politician can't do it, saying that you've taken it and be linked with that, that's not the purpose of it. It's not to solve the housing problem. It's to be seen that and to be able to get votes in returns. So governments are paternalistic. They know what you want. I have yet to see a government policy being designed on the basis of some surveys of people and saying, what is it you want? Rather than the government, and most governments do that. They design the housing themselves. They tell you what you want. You want to live in a block of flats. On the other hand, you create a situation where everybody expects the government to give you something for free. So when the government says, okay, here it is, you got to pay it, you say, hey, the government in India, why should I pay for it? And you try to default and so on. Most governments do not want to implement policies that have been set up in place by their predecessors, especially if they're good policies. So when you change a government, even if they had a good policy, that's the end of that policy. And that's why, as I said, every government has to start afresh. Even when somebody comes back to power 3 times, each time they introduce a new housing policy. Slight differences. The government is unable to operate at the speed or the scale. No government has been able to produce more than about 7% of the housing need. It's just the whole way that the government operates is that. Even when it does produce, when it does act on housing, this is the kind, and this is good. This is good housing. I mean, this is the kind of housing that we think that this is what people want, this is what they can afford, you produce it. But most of government action on housing is of this kind. Those are mud houses, they're not that bad. They're bad, not as good as they could be, because the people who live there know that any time these guys could come and demolish it. And so they're not going to make the investment that they can make. And if you look at government action, it's concerned with that. Look at what has happened to housing provision. The city of Lahore, just very crudely, what I've done is to say, this was the size of Lahore by 1900. I've done this in 50-year chunks. By 1950, Lahore had expanded to this. During 1950 to 2000, Lahore has expanded to sort of this. And since 20,000, all of this outside has expanded. These are all housing schemes. Out of these, there are only, well, or at least when I counted or looked at it, 3 housing schemes built in this period between 50 and 2000, which even tried to respond or were aimed at low-income people. The rest of it is for upper or middle-income people. And so if you look at the result of this is, if you like, government, local government, city governments approving schemes. You may be familiar with this. This diagram shows in these numbers here, that's these chaps standing here, that's the population. So 68% of Lahore's population is low income. At that time, it's defined as 8 to 30,000. So it's not very low, it's quite a large range. So almost 70% of the population is in that group. The medium income, 30,000 to 250,000, is 20%. And the rich, that's above 250,000, constitute 12%. These are the houses approved in these housing schemes. 56% of the housing that has been approved is affordable for the rich. That means for this 12% of the population, 56% of the houses in the housing schemes. For the 20% middle income population, 43% of the housing schemes or the houses in housing schemes. But when we come to the problem or the problem area that we are talking about, that is 68, almost two-thirds, three-quarters of the population, only 1% of the housing in these housing schemes is being of a type that can be afforded by these. So that's where we are with, it's not even government policy, it's what government, city governments do. So it's not a surprise that we have a housing problem.